Welcome to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. And today, Arif, I thought we'd talk about something we're hearing more and more about. People are talking about it. It's in the news, and that term is inflation. Are you hearing it out there?
Oh, absolutely. We're hearing it everywhere, Mike. And you always run the risk of overusing a word and therefore diminishing its value. You see that in everyday life. But currently, we're at a time where we're hearing inflation at a federal level. When it comes to the budget, we're hearing about the printing of money and how that is reflected in inflation. We're hearing about inflation in municipal budgets as it's that time of year. But certainly, it is impacted in an area that represents 25% of the GDP, which is the real estate, home building, housing, renovation, supply market. So definitely,
it's out there. It's ever and interesting. Doing just a little bit of reading on this before the show, and we've seen year over year price increases. We're all aware things get more expensive with time. But what I wasn't aware of was just how far back you have to go before you see, like, literally, we've had little over 3% inflation almost every year for the past 100 years, except for a few rare instances. And we may remember from our own childhood when those inflation numbers were up higher. But right now, what we are seeing is 4.5% inflation this year over the last year, which is a little bit, I wouldn't say unprecedented, but certainly in the last 2 decades, we have not seen inflation at that high of a number. So
I'm going to put some things into some context there with you, because you're absolutely right. And I'm glad you did the research. It's useful. Here's the reality. First and foremost, we have to come to accept that no single action works in isolation. They say every action has a reaction. There's always a ripple effect. So whatever we do domestically has an impact internationally, globally, whether it's our buying power or whether it's another area where it represents or reflects itself is in politicians, for example, doing something that they feel will help us today and help us now and have an immediate impact. Whether that's to get votes or not is really irrelevant, but whether they can please Canadians or the electorate in the here and now to quell some stresses, but then how does that actually have an impact down the road that has probably a far greater or negative consequence?
Yeah, well, and there are a number of influencing factors aside from political decisions, or maybe political decisions are behind some of them, but we're dealing with global supply chain issues right now. We have been for quite some time. There's product shortages, rising oil prices, and there's just pandemic-related influences on our economy and the flow of goods and services. And all of this combined, along with rising oil prices, it's hitting us. When we go into the grocery store, our utility costs, just filling up our gas tank every day, all of these things are becoming increasingly expensive.
So let's look at
power is diminishing.
The knee-jerk reaction, probably including myself, at least once a week when I'm going to fill up the tank, is that this is profit taking, that somebody is taking advantage of a scenario. But what is that 10% jump in oil prices or prices per liter at the pump? And it is definitely inflation related. What does it mean? It means when, for example, when our existing dollar doesn't go as far, or it means when we dilute the market with printed money, therefore that dollar is no longer worth what a dollar was worth yesterday, right? So therefore it takes more dollars to buy the same thing. That is a layperson's, my version of an interpretation of what inflation is. I'm sure there's an economist out there who has a far more technical explanation, but I think that sums it up pretty well. And so what we can tell, what is happening is when the federal government, for example, has been flooding the market with subsidy checks of one form or another. I'm not going to state my opinion on it now, whether I think it's right or wrong. However, it's in order to ease ease the burden and ease the pressures is that immediate influence that the government is trying to have, but it actually has a long last. I mean, it doesn't just disappear. Money doesn't just go away. Debt doesn't just go away. And when it does, it means that we're actually putting a burden on it.
You have to pay the piper at some point. And one of the other tactics or measures that government will do, and our Bank of Canada will typically start increasing interest rates in order to combat inflation. And it's something that historically is done. However, we are at an unprecedented point in Canada where the level of personal debt of Canadians is far higher than it's ever been before, and certainly than it was, say, in the last period of high inflation. So it's a precarious thing to suggest, well, let's just put interest rates up 1 or 2% in order to curb inflation. That would have disastrous impacts economically and then on individual families right across the country with the amount of personal debt that's being carried right now. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, geez, Mike. I mean, I've got a ton of thoughts. Probably none of them are popular, but I think that they're accurate. And that really is that, we've heard the term quantitative easing, and you're talking about mechanisms. The cliche that I can't stand is when you hear politicians talk about, we've got a tool in our toolbox. Well, the tool in the toolbox is the person actually writing the legislation. But what they're doing is, again, that short-term gain, which will result in a longer-term pain. Now, it may not be in your lifetime, depending on how old you are. It may not be in my lifetime. But before we talk about the incremental rise in interest rates to offset inflation, we have to talk about why interest rates were so low to begin with. And that was a mechanism that was utilized based in fear, based on a slowing of the economy, that where the government would have said, we need to stimulate the economy by lowering interest rates, by easing interest rates. And they were at record low. I'll say it again, we're probably 15 years into a 7-year economic cycle.
Yeah.
We have not seen a recession the way we typically would have seen a recession. And so when you artificially reduce the interest rates, basically when any of the automakers gives away vehicles at 0% financing for 72 months or 84 months now, as we're often seeing, that is totally artificial. Nobody's borrowing money at 0%. It doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. So somewhere along the line, somebody is subsidizing that, and it absolutely will impact down the road. We have to go to break, Mike. What I'd like to do is bring it back after the break and talk about how has all of this artificial stimulus or inflation, the subsequent inflation, which the artificial stimulus caused. Let's not kid ourselves about how we are now talking about inflation, but how that now influences the new home and the resale market in Canadian real estate. But we do have to go to break, so stay with us for more fascinating conversation around stimulus and inflation on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif on Rogers TV Barrie. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're talking about inflation, and it's something that's on the lips of more and more people these days. We are seeing changes economically out there. We've been coming through a recession here for the last year and a half, and I'd like to bring it around to a subject that is big for most people, and certainly on this show, and that is, how is inflation impacting upon housing? The cost of shelter, and both for homeowners and for renters in Canada. How is inflation impacting on that? We've certainly seen housing prices increase over the past while. A recent stat for October 2021, the average sale price for a condominium apartment in Barrie was $528,000, which is up 14% from the same time last year. And the cost for detached houses, I don't have the number in front of me, but I believe it was even more significant than that 14%. So, costs all around, especially with housing, what I would like to talk to you about, Arif, is what are your thoughts? Where do you see this rendering itself? How is this going to impact on our daily lives? There's obvious things, but there's also things behind that we maybe not think about or anticipate that are going to happen as a result of inflation. Any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Again, Mike, I mean, these are huge questions, and there's the inside voice and there's the outside voice. I'll tell you that. Really, I want to make a distinction, though, from my perspective. I'm sure somebody smarter than me is probably saying the same thing. I hope so. And that is that I believe that there is a distinction between the crisis that we are witnessing in terms of inflation right now and what brought that about. And that is the weakened dollar. That is, it costs more for the same thing. That is because we diluted our dollar. We have artificially low interest rates, as we talked about, to stimulate the economy. I don't know that we were really in a recession as much as we were in a slowing period. I don't know that we were in a negative growth cycle, but the government's decisions were that we needed to stimulate the economy. So we artificially injected cheap cash, which therefore only served to allow those of us who are either in a bind because we don't have as much buying power because salaries or wages haven't kept pace with inflation, or it might be an either or an and, or that we have been less disciplined than maybe someone would have suggested we should be. Because money's cheap, we go out and say, I can afford more now. So we go and buy more stuff that we may or may not need. And we have to determine what is a priority or an essential item. Let's call it a need versus a want. But let's distinguish that inflation from the supply and demand argument around housing prices. So what I would argue is that inflation and supply and demand equally, and both, maybe not equally, but both have impacted the cost of goods. Add to it COVID, and we have supply chain management. So we don't just have supply and demand issues, but we've got real supply issues through supply chain bottlenecks due to COVID, where we've got thousands of shipping containers at sea that can't make it to port, for example, or we've got manufacturing that is shut down. So in the home renovation or the home building marketplace, we've got materials that used to cost 1x that are now costing 3x. And that's obviously having a very understandable and reasonable impact on the cost to purchase. I'm not going to sell my home.
Certainly with new homes, yes.
For the same price if it cost me 100% more in materials to do it. So we've got two. I think we've got inflation and we've got supply and demand, and they're not necessarily the same, but they're both having an absolute impact.
And they are connected for sure.
Absolutely.
And,
so in terms of the question though, around how is that impacting us? Certainly on the new home sales, prices are through the roof. On resale homes, yes, prices are through the roof. Cost of shelter in terms of rent, that's also supply and demand as people have exited the major metropolitan areas for more remote or outlying areas. It's put upward increase on the stagnant inventory of supply of rental housing. So there you go. There's your supply and demand challenge.
Yeah. And new sale homes and resale homes, the values and the influences on each, they're not independent of one another. When there's pressures towards builders and developers to increase their prices to cover costs, that filters down to the resale market as well. Again, they're not independent of one another. They're always within a few degrees of one another.
Sorry, Mike, I'm talking over you. I apologize. You're treading on something that I know we're itching to get into, but it's a fine line. I think it's a fair argument to say that if I decide to get into something today, I'm going to do my budgeting and I'm going to assess what my costs of labor are, what my costs for the land are, what my costs of materials are, and the price that I'm able to turn around it and sell it for a respectable and reasonable profit are reflected in that price. I have to do that accounting and I have to do that budgeting. So Mike, you're absolutely correct. We've seen housing prices go from the mid 200s to the mid 400s and 500s. We're now starting at the mid 600s and 700s, if not higher. The catch is you used to be getting a fully detached home for anywhere in the low to mid 400s. Now you're getting a semi or a condo starting in the mid to high 600s, right? So,
Yes.
yeah. So I think it's fair in that context.
Yeah. And when we do come back, I don't know how close we are to cutting away for break here, but just a teaser for that third segment. There is an interesting thing, scary thing that takes place when in the development of new housing between the approval process and the down payment being put on a new property and the completion of that property. There's a good length of time that takes place. And when your economic situation drastically changes over the course of that, it can have impacts. And when we do come back from the break, we're going to talk about an actual scenario where that has happened, and just bounce opinions off each other on how that's manifested itself and who's responsible and who should be looking out for that.
Yeah, well, stay tuned. When we do come back from the break, and I think now's a good time to go there, Mike. When we do come back from the break, let's absolutely get into that. And I think, I have always done my very best, and I know you have as well. I think we will do our best to be fair. And I think being fair will include being a little bit scathing where appropriate. So there's your teaser for coming back right after this break. Stay with us for more of Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, more invigorating conversation on Rogers TV Barrie. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're talking about inflation and how that comes about and how it impacts on all our lives. But most specifically for this last segment of the show, we're going to talk about how it impacts on real estate. Specifically, one story, there was a developer right here in Barrie that generated international headlines recently when they canceled 70 contracts or set deals a year ago with buyers of under construction condo units, unless those buyers agreed to an additional $100,000 cost to make up for either losses or increased costs for the developer for that project, for those individual units. And as I say, this was international or national headlines anyways. I was in Prince Edward Island a week ago, and my brother-in-law, it was one of the first things he mentioned to me was, hey, what's happening with those condos in Barrie? And I was surprised that this was a story at that level, but it is significant. I don't know if it's a one-off or this is maybe the start of something we're going to see more of, but I'd like to talk a little bit about this with you on, first of all, how this may have came about. And let's have a look at this and see where the responsibility lies for this.
Sure. Geez, Mike, you keep asking questions that you could go on for miles or hours about. Let's first address the issue of, is this a first? And the answer is no, it's not a first. It's not a first for a variety of reasons. It has been a tactic used over decades, if not longer.
Well, there are always adjustments
in the construction industry.
Yeah.
And let's be clear, the developer in question, anybody who's read the newspaper knows who it is. It's Pace Developments. This is not a first-time builder. This is a veteran builder. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 30 years in the industry of building. Mm-hmm. So let's just hold that over here to come back to in just a second. This guy's, this developer, Pace, has been doing this for 30 years.
Yeah.
So they've seen a cycle or two, and they've built a home or two. They know the process. So this is not so a couple of things. One, that tactic has been used before. Two, you have to accept the fact that contracts for buying a home are probably 30, 50, 100 pages long, depending on who's writing it. And buried in there, they've hired some pretty good lawyers who make sure that their interests are protected, including clauses such as the one that was triggered that said, at the sole discretion of the buyer, of course, only under reasonable circumstances. If we feel the need that we're upside down, we're going to come to you and ask for more for
So
unforeseen costs.
Yeah, they were within their legal rights to do so, according to the contract, and that clause that is in there, morally or ethically is another question.
Oh, don't get me wrong.
But again, these were contracts that were put together more than 2 years ago. Just pre-pandemic, in fact. So a lot has changed. As we touched on, building material costs have gone up. So that argument can be made that the cost to build this property have increased and they're looking to cover them. But you could just as easily make the argument that the average price for that unit then versus now was at least $100,000 less. So some are going to ask, are they just looking to recoup losses they may incur just based on market value increase? They don't want to leave money on the table, or are they legitimately trying to cover themselves for money they've already put out? Or is it a bit of both? We may never know, but it's interesting to speculate on.
I'm going to give you my opinion, and I think it's an educated one. I trust that it's an educated one. It's my opinion. Mm-hmm. Here's the reality. It's opportunism. I'll tell you why. I think it's opportunism. Yes, absolutely. The price of homes has gone up. Yes, supply and demand has increased the price of homes. That's supply and demand. Supply and demand means if there's a low supply, I can demand more if there's a demand to sell my home.
That's what free enterprise is.
That is if I choose to sell. If I choose to hold off today and sell tomorrow, I'm making a calculated hedge or guess that I might get more money tomorrow if I wait and sell it in 2 years from now instead of 2 years ago. That's fine. But if I've entered into a contract, then I should not be able to execute a clause that is totally, in my opinion, frivolously being executed. My opinion. Okay, so here's why it's my opinion. Okay, when a developer decides to go into purchasing land and going through the process, by the way, it's nobody's fault but your own if you're a first-time developer and you realize later on that it took you an extra 2 years to get through the process, whether it's a red tape process or whether another type of labor shortage process, whatever it is, that's on you. You as a developer are responsible for knowing the buyer beware type of, beware of what you get yourself into. However, here's the scenario. Financing 101, end of story, no questions asked. When you're a developer, you go to the bank to get money to do your financing. The bank will say, show us that you have secured your cost of materials, a contract for your cost of materials. You may not be building for a year from now. You might not be building for 2 years from now. Show us that you secured a contract because we're not giving you financing. The reason being, if you're willy-nilly and you don't secure your price of materials and the price of materials goes up 3% on an item that may represent 20, 30, 40, 50% of your cost, call it concrete, cement, whatever, timber, lumber, etc. If your cost goes up 3% on something that's 50% of your cost, you could sink a project. So a financing company is going to say, Mr. Developer, love the project. Show me that you secured your prices because we, the bank, don't want to be left trying to resell something when it's upside down. So this is nonsense. This is pure profit taking. I don't buy the excuse personally. And I think 100% the developer's wrong morally or ethically.
Well, that's your thoughts on that, but they coincide with what the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, has said as well. He made it clear that the brunt of this falls with the builder, not with the buyer, and they have a contract. They need to follow through on that contract. So,
Mike, my opinion is we got to go, and I'm sorry I ranted there, but my opinion is that the law may be what it is today, and these particularly impacted or affected homeowners might not come out happy, but I certainly think that it will stimulate the existing government to amend the law to prevent this from happening in the future. Gut instinct.
Yeah, and it does lend a little bit of credence to the resale versus buy new phenomena. There's a lot more guarantee with buying resale that I found being in the real estate business over the last 20 years. There's a lot of things that are in the air. Closing dates.
I think there's
closing
another show,
thoughts
Mike.
with
We
you?
do have to go. We're into the credits. We got to go, but there's definitely another show here. Thanks for a
For
great
sure.
conversation. We'll see you next time on Hitting Home with
Excellent.
Mike.